Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Threshold of the Beast. The iron gates of the Townsend estate didn't just creak, they groaned with the weight of a decade's worth of rust and secrets. Emerson Williams adjusted his spectacles, the cool, damp air of the valley carrying the scent of impending rain and something sharper, the ancient, resinous tang of cedarwood. He didn't look like a man about to enter a lion's den. With his charcoal coat buttoned to the chin and a leather satchel gripped firmly in his right hand, Emerson looked exactly like what he was, a man of order. But beneath the polished exterior, his own scent of Oakmoss, deep, earthy, and immovable, pulsed with a quiet, dominant frequency. Mr. Williams, the executor had warned him, the Alpha hasn't seen a sunlit room in 3 years. He doesn't want to be civilized. He wants to be left to rot. Emerson stepped into the foyer. The manor was a tomb of Victorian opulence, choked by dust and the oppressive silence of a man who had forgotten how to be human. There were no lights. The only illumination came from the gray afternoon filtering through grime-streaked windows. He didn't wait for a servant. He followed the scent. The cedarwood grew stronger as he approached the grand gallery, but it was tainted, sour with the pheromones of prolonged distress and predatory territorialism. Emerson pushed the heavy oak doors open. The room was a wreck. Canvas frames were shredded, and heavy furniture had been overturned as if by a physical gale. In the far corner, crouched atop a mahogany table, was Maurice Townsend. His hair was a tangled mane of dark silk, and his eyes, when they caught the light, flashed with a terrifying, primal amber. He wasn't wearing a shirt, the corded muscle of his back was a map of old, jagged scars that hummed with the history of a dark past Emerson had only read about in redacted files. Maurice didn't growl. He simply vanished from the table, a blur of motion that ended with Emerson being slammed against the stone wall. A heavy hand clamped around Emerson's throat, not crushing, but threatening. Maurice was inches away, his breath hot against Emerson's cheek. The Alpha's scent peaked, a violent explosion of cedar and wood smoke intended to make any lesser man collapse in submission. Emerson's heart hammered against his ribs, but his expression remained a mask of crystalline glass. He didn't struggle. Instead, he let his own scent expand. He released the oak moss, thick, damp, and cooling, like a forest floor absorbing a wildfire. "Your posture is poor, Mr. Townsend," Emerson said, his voice a low, steady baritone that didn't tremble. "And your grip is inefficient. If you intended to kill me, you've already missed your window." Maurice froze. His nostrils flared, twitching as he inhaled the unexpected stability of the tutor's pheromones. The predatory fire in his eyes flickered, confused by the lack of fear. He leaned closer, his nose brushing the column of Emerson's throat, hovering over the scent gland. "I am Emerson Williams," the tutor continued, staring directly into the Alpha's blown-out pupils. "I am here to return what you've lost. Now, unhand me. We have a great deal of work to do." For a heartbeat, the tension was a wire pulled to the snapping point. Then, slowly, the pressure on Emerson's throat vanished. Maurice recoiled, his movements jerky and unpracticed, retreating back into the safety of the shadows. Emerson straightened his collar, his composure absolute. He set his satchel on a nearby upright chair. "We shall begin with the alphabet of silence," Emerson murmured, opening a book. "Since that is the only language you seem to remember." Chapter 2, Oakmoss vs. Cedar. The following week was a psychological siege, fought not with raised voices, but with the steady ticking of a grandfather clock and the rustle of turning pages. Emerson did not try to force Maurice into a chair. He did not bark orders or demand eye contact. Instead, he occupied the grand gallery for 4 hours every morning, a colonial outpost of civilization in the middle of Morris's ruins. He brought a small folding desk, a thermos of tea, and a stack of leather-bound volumes. Maurice was a ghost in the periphery. He moved through the rafters and the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains, his presence signaled only by the occasional creak of floorboards or the heavy, resinous scent of cedarwood that grew more agitated whenever Emerson turned a page. The Roman Empire did not fall in a day, Maurice, Emerson said quietly, his voice cutting through the gloom. He didn't look up from his book. It eroded. Much like this house. Much like your resolve to remain a phantom. A low, vibrating rumble echoed from the darkness, a warning. Emerson poured a cup of tea. The scent of Oakmoss shifted, deepening into something rich and damp, the olfactory equivalent of a weighted blanket. You find my presence invasive. That is understandable. But your growling is a poor substitute for syntax. If you wish me to leave, you will have to ask. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. Maurice dropped from the shadows, landing silently on all fours a mere 3 feet from Emerson's desk. He looked less like a man and more like a cornered wolf, his hair fell over his face, but his amber eyes were fixed on the movement of Emerson's throat. He was testing the air, his nostrils flaring as he drank in the Tutor's scent. The Oakmoss was steady, lacking the sharp tang of adrenaline that Maurice was used to eliciting. It confused him. It acted like a sedative, dragging his jagged nerves toward a shoreline of calm he hadn't felt in years. Maurice edged closer, his movements fluid and predatory. He reached out a scarred hand, his fingers hovering inches from the book Emerson was reading. He didn't grab it. Instead, he let his fingertips graze the edge of the paper. It's a treatise on architecture, Emerson murmured, finally tilting his head to meet Maurice's gaze. The art of building things that last. Something you used to be quite fond of, according to your records. Maurice's expression flickered, a spasm of pain, then a flash of recognition. He let out a sharp, exhaled huff and suddenly retreated, turning his back and hunkering down against the far wall. He didn't leave, though. He sat within the radius of Emerson's scent, his head resting on his knees. Emerson began to read aloud. He didn't choose a children's primer or a simple text, he read the dense, rhythmic prose of the classics. He used his voice as a tool, a rhythmic anchor to pull Maurice out of the chaotic feedback loop of his own trauma. By the 3rd hour, the cedarwood scent in the room had lost its bitter, acidic edge. It began to smell like a forest after a fire, charred, but settling into the cool earth. For the first time, the tutor and the recluse shared the same air without the intent to draw blood. Emerson packed his bag precisely at noon. As he reached the door, he looked back. Maurice was still sitting in the shadows, staring at the empty space where the book had been. Tomorrow, Maurice, Emerson said. We shall discuss the foundation. Maurice didn't answer, but as Emerson walked down the hall, he heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a chair being pushed back into place. The first stone of the bridge had been laid. Chapter 3, The First Fracture. The silence of the Townsend manor was never true silence, it was a pressurized void. For Emerson, the 3rd week was defined by the realization that the dust in this house didn't just settle, it buried. While Maurice was sequestered in the high rafters of the library, Emerson took it upon himself to explore the West Wing, a section of the house the executors had vaguely described as under renovation. The air here was different. The cedarwood was faint, replaced by the smell of wax, old iron, and something metallic that made the hair on Emerson's arms stand up. He pushed open a set of double doors and found himself in a sterile, white-tiled room that looked less like a bedroom and more like a laboratory. In the center, the floorboards were scarred with deep, rhythmic gouges, claw marks. Near the corner, a dark, brownish bloom stained the wood. Emerson knelt, his fingers hovering over the stain. He didn't need a forensic kit to know what he was looking at. This was where the civilizing had been attempted before him. This was where the dark past had bled. A floorboard groaned behind him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The scent of cedarwood didn't just drift in, it slammed into the space like a physical weight, sharp and jagged with the smell of a cornered animal. Emerson turned slowly. Maurice stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hallway. His chest was heaving, his pupils so dilated that his eyes looked like hollow black pits. He wasn't just angry, he was reliving the moment that stain was made. In a flash of terrifying speed, Maurice was across the room. He didn't strike, but his momentum drove Emerson back against the cold, tiled wall. A heavy forearm pinned Emerson's chest, and a hand tangled into his hair, forcing his head back to expose the vulnerable line of his throat. "Is this it, Maurice?" Emerson asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum. He forced his heart rate to decelerate, projecting a wave of Oakmoss, cool, damp, and steady, into the suffocating heat of the Alpha's rage. "Is this where they broke you?" Maurice's jaw worked, a strangled sound dying in his throat. He leaned in, his teeth bared near Emerson's ear, but as he inhaled, he caught the tutor's scent. The Oakmoss didn't fight him, it offered a place to land. The Alpha's aggression snapped. The hand in Emerson's hair didn't pull, it gripped, and Maurice buried his face into the crook of Emerson's neck. He wasn't biting. He was scent marking. He dragged his nose against the sensitive skin of Emerson's scent gland, over and over, desperate to overwrite the memory of blood and bleach with the smell of the forest floor. Emerson felt the tremors racking Maurice's large frame. The monster was shaking. Risking a limb, Emerson slowly raised his hand and rested it on the back of Maurice's neck, his fingers brushing the coarse silk of his hair. "I see you," Emerson whispered. "Not the beast they tried to cage. I see the man they tried to bury." Maurice let out a broken, jagged sob, a sound that hadn't crossed his lips in years. He pressed closer, his weight nearly crushing Emerson against the wall, but for the first time, the proximity wasn't a threat. It was a plea. The blood-stained secrets of the West Wing remained on the floor, but the wall Maurice had built around his heart had finally cracked. As they stood in the dim light of the laboratory, the sharp cedarwood began to soften, folding into the oakmoss until the room no longer smelled of a crime scene, but of a sanctuary. Chapter 4: The Intellectual Bridge. The air in the manor had changed. The predatory tension that once vibrated through the floorboards had settled into a wary, fragile truce. Emerson realized that words, in their traditional sense, were still too heavy for Maurice to carry. To reach the man beneath the trauma, he had to speak a language that bypassed the analytical mind and went straight to the soul. He moved the lessons to the music room. It was a cavernous space, dominated by a Steinway grand piano that had sat under a silk shroud for years. Emerson pulled the sheet away, sending a cloud of dust dancing into the afternoon light. He sat at the bench, not waiting for Maurice to emerge from his usual corner of shadows. Emerson began to play. He chose Satie, minimalist, haunting, and repetitive. The notes were like droplets of water hitting a still pond. He didn't look back, but he smelled the cedarwood shift. It moved from the doorway to the center of the room, no longer sharp with the scent of a hunt, but curious, humming with a low-frequency resonance. "You were a polymath, Maurice," Emerson said, his hands never leaving the keys. "Architecture was your career, but the piano was your private sanctuary. The records say you stopped playing the night the world turned its back on you." A floorboard creaked. A shadow fell over the ivory keys. Maurice stood beside him, his large, scarred hands twitching at his sides. He looked at the piano with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror, as if the instrument were a living thing that might bite him. Emerson slid over on the bench, leaving exactly half the seat vacant. It was a blatant invitation, a piece of forced proximity that demanded a choice. Slowly, with the hesitant grace of a creature stepping into a clearing, Maurice sat. His heat was a physical presence, radiating against Emerson's side. The scent of oakmoss flared, steadying the air, acting as a buffer for the alpha's mounting anxiety. Maurice reached out. His fingers, thickened by years of neglect and violence, hovered over the lower octaves. He pressed a single C-sharp. The note was discordant, jarring against Satie's melody. Emerson didn't flinch. He simply incorporated the note, shifting his right hand to turn the discord into a bridge. He played a harmony around Maurice's single, lonely strike. Emphasized by the silence of the house, a conversation began. Maurice struck another note, then two, a jagged, mournful motif that spoke of the laboratory floor, the cold tiles, and the years of being a beast. Emerson met every jagged edge with a soft curve of melody. He used the Oakmoss scent to signal safety, his shoulder brushing against Maurice's. The alpha's breathing, once shallow and ragged, began to sync with the rhythm of the music. For an hour, they existed in a world without executors, without bloodstains, and without the labels of Tutor and Alpha. Maurice's playing became more fluid, his genius peeking through the rust. He wasn't just a broken man, he was a master architect of sound, building a cathedral of grief in the middle of the afternoon. When the final chord faded into the velvet curtains, Maurice didn't retreat. He stayed on the bench, his shoulder pressed firmly against Emerson's. The scent in the room was a perfect, seamless blend, the earthiness of the moss and the strength of the wood, woven together by the lingering vibration of the strings. "That," Emerson whispered into the silence, "is your voice, Maurice. Don't ever let them tell you that you've lost it." Maurice turned his head, his amber eyes searching Emerson's face with a devastating clarity. He didn't speak, but he reached out and touched the sleeve of Emerson's coat, a silent acknowledgement that the bridge was no longer a theory. It was solid ground. Chapter 5, The Bloom of the Rut. The weather had been brewing for days, a heavy, electric stillness that made the hair on Emerson's neck prickle. When the storm finally broke, it wasn't with a drizzle, but with a violent, sky-splitting crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor. Inside, the atmosphere was far more dangerous. Emerson found Maurice in the master bedroom, a place he usually avoided. The room was a tempest of cedarwood, but the scent had curdled. It was no longer the smell of a forest, it was the smell of a forest fire, scorched, desperate, and suffocating. Maurice was on the floor, his back against the bed frame, his fingers clawing at the fine silk sheets. His skin was slick with sweat, and his body was racked by tremors so violent his teeth chattered. "Maurice," Emerson said, his voice a steady blade cutting through the thick pheromonal fog. Maurice looked up, and for the first time, Emerson felt a genuine chill of fear. The Alpha's eyes were no longer amber, they were a glowing, molten gold, entirely consumed by the rut, the biological fever that, for a traumatized Alpha, was less of a reproductive cycle and more of a psychic break. "Get out," Maurice choked out, his voice a raw, tectonic rasp. It was the most he had spoken in weeks, and it was a plea for Emerson's life. "The cage, lock the door." "I am not putting you in a cage," Emerson replied. He moved forward, ignoring every instinct that screamed at him to flee from the apex predator in the room. As he approached, the scent of Oakmoss exploded from him, not as a gentle suggestion, but as a dominant, grounding force. He shed his suit jacket, throwing it aside, and sat directly on the floor in front of Maurice. Maurice lunged. He didn't bite, but he caught Emerson by the shoulders, pinning him to the floorboards with a strength that threatened to bruise. He hovered over the tutor, his chest heaving, his muzzle buried in the crook of Emerson's neck. He was searching for the source of the Oakmoss, his hot breath ghosting over Emerson's skin. "I'm here," Emerson whispered, his hands coming up to cradle Maurice's face. The Alpha's skin was burning. "Stay with me. Don't look at the shadows. Look at the forest." Maurice let out a low, pained whine, a sound of pure agony. In his state, the thunder outside was the sound of his past captors, and the shadows on the wall were the ghosts of the West Wing. He was drowning in his own adrenaline. Emerson did something he had never dared, he pulled the Alpha into his lap. He wrapped his arms around the larger man's shaking frame, forcing a deep, skin-to-skin proximity. He began to hum, the same Satie melody they had played on the piano, and projected a steady, unwavering pulse of pheromonal calm. The effect was gradual but profound. Maurice's grip on Emerson's shoulders loosened, his fingers unfurling. He slumped against Emerson's chest, his face hidden in the tutor's shirt, breathing in the scent of damp earth and stability. "You are safe," Emerson murmured, his own heart finally slowing its frantic pace. "The storm is outside, Maurice. It cannot come in here." Hours passed as the gale lashed against the manor windows. In the middle of the dark room, the two men remained locked together. The forced proximity had stripped away the last of their professional barriers. There was no tutor and no beast, only two souls tethered together in the dark, the Oakmoss and the Cedarwood finally finding a rhythm that didn't involve conflict, but survival. As Maurice finally fell into a deep, exhausted sleep against Emerson's chest, the tutor knew the assignment had changed. He wasn't just civilizing a man, he was reclaiming a life from the wreckage. And he realized, with a startle of his own, that he was no longer an impartial observer. He was a participant in the architecture of Maurice's soul. Chapter 6: Blood-Stained Secrets. The fever of the rut had broken, leaving the manor in a state of fragile, exhausted clarity. The storm had passed, but the air remained heavy with the aftermath of their shared intimacy. Maurice didn't retreat to the shadows this time. He sat by the window in a tattered armchair, the morning light catching the sharp angles of his face, making him look more like the architect he once was and less like the ghost he had become. Emerson sat across from him, nursing a cold cup of tea. He felt a strange ache in his chest, a lingering echo of the Alpha's heartbeat against his own. "You stayed," Maurice said. The voice was rough, like gravel shifting under a deep current, but it was clear. It was the first full sentence Maurice had uttered in 3 years. Emerson didn't let his surprise show, though his hand tightened slightly around his cup. "I told you I would," Emerson replied. "I don't make a habit of lying to my students." Maurice looked at his hands, the hands that had clawed at floorboards and pinned Emerson to walls. "They told me I was a monster. After the trial, after the blood. I started to believe them. It was easier to be a beast than a man who had lost everything." "Tell me about the blood, Maurice," Emerson said softly. "The West Wing. The stains on the floor. I found the records, but the ink is blacked out. Who was it?" Maurice's scent, that deep, resonant cedarwood, shuddered, momentarily turning acrid with a flash of old terror. He closed his eyes, and the story spilled out like a long-held breath. "My cousin," Maurice whispered. "The lead executor of the estate now. He wanted the inheritance, the patents for my structural designs. There was an altercation, a setup. He brought a girl here, an Omega from the village, and triggered my pheromones with synthetics. He wanted a scandal. When I resisted, when I tried to get her away from him, he panicked. He used a fireplace poker on her, then on me." Maurice's breath hitched. "He told the police I'd gone feral in a rut. That I'd attacked her. Because of my status as a high alpha, no one questioned the uncontrollable nature of my biology. They used my own instincts to convict me in the eyes of the public. They locked me in that wing for rehabilitation. It wasn't medicine, Emerson. It was torture." Emerson felt a cold, predatory fury rising within his own Oakmoss scent. The civilizing he had been hired to do wasn't for Maurice's benefit, it was a performance for the board of executors to ensure Maurice remained docile enough to keep signing over his rights. "They didn't hire me to fix you," Emerson realized, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "They hired me to be a witness to your instability. To prove you're still a danger so they can keep the conservatorship active indefinitely." Maurice looked at him, his amber eyes wide and vulnerable. "They're coming back tomorrow for the monthly review. If I don't look cured, they'll send me to the institute in the north. If I look too healthy, they'll know I'm a threat to their control." He reached across the small space, his fingers trembling as they brushed the fabric of Emerson's sleeve. "Don't let them take the light back, Emerson. Please." Emerson reached out, covering Maurice's hand with his own. The touch was no longer about professional distance or academic discipline. It was a vow. They think they hired a tutor, Emerson said, his dominant alpha scent flared with a protective, earthy power that filled the room. They don't realize they hired an architect's partner. We aren't going to show them a monster, Maurice. We're going to show them exactly how dangerous a sane man can be. Chapter 7, The Domestic Siege. The morning of the inspection arrived with a deceptive, pale stillness. The Townsend lawyers and the lead executor, Maurice's cousin Julian, arrived in a black sedan that looked like a scavenger circling a dying animal. Inside the manor, the air was scrubbed clean of the chaotic pheromones that had defined the house for years. Emerson stood in the foyer, his suit pressed, his Oakmoss scent dialed back to a professional, sterile hum. Beside him stood Maurice. Maurice was a masterpiece of hidden daggers. He wore a high-collared charcoal sweater that hid the scars on his neck, his hair pulled back, his amber eyes fixed in a state of practiced, glassy indifference. To the world, he looked medicated. To Emerson, who could feel the heat radiating off the alpha's body, he was a coiled spring. "Mr. Williams," Julian said, stepping into the hall with a smirk that didn't reach his cold eyes. He smelled of expensive cologne and the oily scent of a man who had never done his own dirty work. "I trust the beast has been cooperative? Or should we have brought the sedation team?" "Mr. Townsend is remarkably responsive to the right stimuli," Emerson replied, his voice a cool, rhythmic baritone. "Though I've found that 'beast' is an inaccurate term for a man of his intellectual caliber." The inspection began. It was a calculated siege. Julian paced the gallery, intentionally knocking books off the shelves and scraping his chair against the floor, noises designed to trigger Maurice's sensory trauma. He walked close to Maurice, letting his own aggressive, artificial alpha scent spike in an attempt to provoke a snarl. Emerson watched from the periphery, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every time Maurice's jaw tightened or his claws began to unsheath, Emerson would shift, releasing a subtle, grounding pulse of Oakmoss. It was a silent conversation. "I am here. Stay in the light. Don't give him what he wants." "He's too quiet," Julian hissed, leaning into Maurice's personal space. "What did you do to him, Tutor? Lobotomize him?" Julian reached out, his hand hovering near the piano, the sanctuary they had built together. He picked up a sheet of Maurice's handwritten music and began to crumple it. "This is trash. Emotional debris. It's proof he's still unstable." Maurice's scent spiked. The cedarwood turned sharp as a splintered bone. He took a step forward, his shadow looming over Julian, the predatory instinct finally screaming to be let loose. Emerson didn't move toward them. Instead, he spoke a single word, his voice laced with a gentle, commanding authority. "Maurice." "The foundation." Maurice froze. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of the tutor, the moss, the earth, the safety. He forced his hands to remain open. "The foundation is solid, Julian," Maurice said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm rumble. It was the first time Julian had heard him speak in years. The executor recoiled as if he'd been struck. "And I think you'll find that I am quite capable of managing my own affairs. Starting with your removal from this house." Julian's face went pale, then mottled with rage. "You think a few words make you sane? You're a monster in a sweater, Maurice. The board will never grant you autonomy." "We shall see," Emerson interrupted, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Maurice. The height difference was significant, but the unity was absolute. "The board will receive my full report tonight. It details not only Mr. Townsend's recovery but the irregular conditions under which he was kept prior to my arrival." The threat was clear. The tutor wasn't just teaching grammar, he was documenting a crime. As Julian retreated to his car, his scent sour with fear, Maurice didn't collapse. He turned to Emerson, his hand finding the tutor's in the dim light of the foyer. The siege wasn't over, but the walls of the manor were no longer a cage. They were a fortress, and for the first time in his life, Maurice wasn't defending it alone. Chapter 8, The High-Stakes Reclamation. The night before the hearing, the manor felt less like a home and more like a command center. The air was thick, not with the suffocating trauma of the past, but with the electric, ionized scent of an approaching front. In the grand library, legal briefs and medical counter-reports lay scattered across the mahogany table like shrapnel. Emerson worked under the low glow of a shaded lamp, his fingers moving tirelessly over a fountain pen. He was drafting the final testimony that would either dismantle Julian's conservatorship or see them both cast out. "You should sleep," Maurice's voice came from the shadows. He stepped into the light, and the difference from the man Emerson had met months ago was staggering. Maurice was no longer crouching, he stood tall, his shoulders broad and set. Yet, as he approached the table, his scent, that deep, resonant cedarwood, flickered with a trace of charcoal. "I can't," Emerson admitted, looking up. The dark circles under his eyes were a testament to the stakes. "If I miss one legal loophole, Julian will use it to pivot. He's cornered, Maurice. Cornered animals are the most dangerous." Maurice leaned over the table, his large hands bracing against the wood, effectively boxing Emerson in. The forced proximity, once a tool of discipline, had become a source of mutual gravity. "He's right about one thing, Emerson. I am a high alpha. If the board sees even a flicker of the beast tomorrow, if my scent spikes, if I lose my temper, they will side with him. It's a rigged game." Maurice reached out, his thumb tracing the sharp line of Emerson's jaw. "You should leave tonight. If I fail, they'll come for you next. They'll say you're an enabler, that you've been compromised." Emerson didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch, his own Oakmoss scent rising to meet the cedar, cool and defiant. "I was compromised the moment I decided you were worth saving, Maurice. I'm not going anywhere." The tension in the room snapped into something visceral. Maurice groaned, a low, melodic sound, and pulled Emerson up from the chair. He didn't pin him to the wall this time, he pulled him into a crushing, desperate embrace. "Mark me," Maurice whispered against the pulse point of Emerson's neck. Emerson stiffened. Marking was usually the prerogative of the alpha, a claim of territory. But Maurice was asking for the reverse. He wanted the tutor's stability to be etched into his very skin. He was offering his throat, his pride, and his future. Emerson didn't hesitate. He tilted Maurice's head back, his fingers tangling in that dark, silken hair. He pressed his face to the alpha's scent gland, breathing in the cedar before sinking his teeth in, not with the intent to harm, but with the precision of a seal being pressed into wax. The sting was sharp, followed by a rush of pheromonal bonding that made the world tilt. Emerson's Oakmoss flooded Maurice's system, a literal chemical anchor that would hold the alpha steady against whatever psychological storms Julian threw at him the next day. When Emerson pulled back, Maurice's eyes were clear, the amber glowing with a new, focused light. He looked down at the tutor, his gaze reverent. "The foundation is set," Maurice murmured, his voice now a perfect, steady resonance. They stood together in the quiet library, two architects of a new reality. The high-stakes battle for Maurice's soul had reached its crescendo, and as the first light of dawn began to gray the windows, they weren't preparing for a defense. They were preparing for a reclamation. Chapter 9, The Architecture of Peace. The hearing was not a massacre, it was a dissection. With the mark of Emerson's Oakmoss still humming beneath his collar, Maurice had sat before the board of executors with the stillness of a marble monument. He hadn't snarled when Julian brought up the feral incidents. He hadn't flinched when the lawyers played grainy security footage of his darkest days. Instead, he had spoken with the precision of a man who spent his life measuring stress loads and structural integrity, calmly dismantling Julian's financial discrepancies until the cousin's own scent turned to the sour, sharp stench of a cornered rat. By the time the board delivered their verdict, full restoration of autonomy and a permanent restraining order against the former executors, the air in the hearing room had shifted. The beast was dead, the architect had returned. 2 weeks later, the Townsend manor no longer smelled of dust and stagnant grief. The windows were thrown wide, allowing the spring air to chase out the ghosts of the west wing. The blood-stained boards had been replaced with fresh, aromatic pine, and the laboratory had been gutted to make room for a sun-drenched drafting studio. Emerson stood in the garden, watching the sunset bleed across the valley. He had officially resigned as Maurice's tutor 3 days prior. His satchel was packed, sitting by the front door, yet he hadn't found the strength to pick it up. The assignment was over, but the reclamation felt unfinished. "The proportions are wrong," a voice rumbled behind him. Emerson turned to see Maurice stepping onto the terrace. He looked healthy, his skin bronzed by the sun, his hair trimmed, and his amber eyes warm and steady. He held a book in one hand, his finger marking a page in the very same architecture treatise Emerson had used to break his silence. "The proportions of what?" Emerson asked, a faint, witty smile tugging at his lips. "This house," Maurice said, stopping just inches from Emerson. The scent of cedarwood was no longer a warning, it was an embrace, anchored deeply by the lingering, earthy spice of Emerson's Oakmoss. It was built for one man to hide in. It wasn't designed for 2 people to live in. Maurice reached out, his hand, now steady and sure, resting on the small of Emerson's back. "I've been sketching new plans. An annex. A library with enough light to grow moss indoors. I think the foundation can support it, provided the right person stays to oversee the construction." Emerson looked up at the man he had been hired to civilize. He saw the scars, yes, but he also saw the brilliant, resilient soul he had fought to bring back to the surface. The professional composure Emerson had worn like armor for years finally cracked, replaced by a raw, authentic heat. "I'm an expensive consultant, Maurice," Emerson teased, though his voice wavered. "I have a lifetime of arrears to pay you," Maurice replied. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against Emerson's. The predator had been tamed, but the alpha remained, protective, devoted, and entirely reclaimed. "Stay. Not as a tutor. Not as a warden. As the anchor." Emerson didn't need to consult his books or his logic. He reached up, tangling his fingers in Maurice's hair, and pulled him into a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and ancient forests. The shadows of the manor had finally retreated, leaving only the light. In the quiet of the evening, the cedar and the oak moss bled into one another, creating a scent that was neither wild nor disciplined, but simply, finally, home.